Hello again everyone, Steve Angel welcoming you to the Traditional Outdoors channel and welcoming you back to our series of 101 style videos around traditional archery and traditional bow hunting, really geared towards helping new and aspiring traditional archers or traditional bow hunters really get into the sport and understand a lot of the terminology and the concepts that we're dealing with. We're starting out very basic and we're going to be building in complexity over time. So depending on where you start in this series, you may want to go back and forth through the series over time, looking for specific concepts. And for that reason, we're keeping all of these very short. We're trying to stay really close to the 10-minute mark. Some may be a good bit less, some may run a little bit over. But generally a 10-minute mark is what we're shooting for here. So don't expect these things to be really lengthy, and we are going to be going through this stuff pretty quickly. So you may want to go back and watch them again just to make sure you captured everything. Today we're going to be talking about bow types and bow styles and giving you a little bit of insight as to what those the terminology means and what you can look for to determine what type of bow you're actually looking at or potentially getting ready to shoot. We won't be talking about what fits certain people and so forth, but we will talk about some generalizations. We will also talk about some general concepts around these bows. So a lot of things in traditional archery have so many dependencies. I say general. If you're talking to someone, you know, next week, you may hear that they disagree with something I may say. It may not be that they necessarily disagree with what I'm saying, but in a different context, what I say may be inaccurate. And it's hard to explain, but I'll try to explain it as I'm going through here and make it make sense. So in order to keep the video short, we're going to get moving. Recurves, that's the first type of bow we're going to talk about. I picked the recurve to go over first because generally speaking, there's a recurve. There's not different styles. There are different makes and models of recurves, and there's differences in how extreme the recurve component is, how short they are, different riser styles, but a recurve is a recurve. The other reason that I picked these to start with is most people that start out are going to start with a recurve bow, especially if they're coming from modern archery or compounds. A couple of reasons for that. One, generally speaking, and this is one of those things I'm talking about, recurves are going to be a little bit faster. Now I say that generally speaking because there are variables there. Arrow weight is a big variable. Generally there are bows that will handle heavy arrows without losing as much velocity as a recurve, but for all intents and purposes, recurves are faster. There are some hybrid style longbows that rival recurves in speed. So again, there's that general statement. So don't get too hung up on it. I'm just telling you why most people start out with a recurve. You can identify a recurve by really two things. You'll have a bow that has this curved design with a limb tip that turns back towards the front of the bow in a pretty radical manner. Now, the key to identifying if it's a recurve and a longbow is because of the way that limb tip curves forward. If the string touches the back of the bow, and the belly of the bow, if the string touches the belly of the bow when it's at rest, then you have a recurve. If it's only touching in the grooves and not touching on the belly, then that would be a longbow, and I'm going to show you some examples of that. That's generally accepted as what's the difference between a recurve and a longbow, because there are some longbows that have that sweeping limb design that comes back towards the front. This is a St. Charles Thunderbird. It's very sweet shooting bow. The other thing I didn't mention, the grip. So most recurves are going to have some kind of locator style or pistol type grip, which is also a lot like a modern compound. That's the third reason that a lot of people start with these first, and you'll see some differences there when I start talking about the longbows. But we're going to keep moving forward in the interest of time. This is a recurve that's unstrung. This is a very old Darton recurve, but you can see what I'm talking about when I say this limb is very much curved, and in the limb tips are pointed back towards the front of the bow. So this is a recurve. If I strung this up, that string would again be touching the belly of the bow here, and that's how you would know it was a recurve. Recurves can generally come from any lengths of roughly 48 inches. I think that's the shortest I've ever seen, up to 62 inches. There may be some a little bit longer than that, but that's the general range that you will find the lengths of recurves. Next, we'll talk about longbows. Couple things before we get talking specifically about this style. One of the types of longbows that you'll hear about often is an English longbow. And I bring that up now because this bow here, which is known as the American semi-longbow, and it's got some other names I'll touch on briefly in a second, is really derived from that English longbow style. Now, most of these bows that we're going to be talking about, these modern bows, are what's called laminated bows. They're made of laminations of wood and then fiberglass on the back and belly to create these bows. So they're laminated bows. And the English longbow was typically a self-bow, which means it was carved out of one piece of wood. And I've got a couple of examples here that I'll go into in a minute. And they're generally longer than these bows, but what's key here is in an English longbow, the back of the bow is flat, just like it is here, while the belly of the bow will be rounded. And if you cut an English longbow limb in half and looked at the cross section, it would have a D shape to it. And the same thing goes for these American semi-longbows. Now you'll also hear these referred to as a hill style longbow and perhaps even a D-shaped longbow. The reason they're named, they may be called a Howard Hill style bow is because Hill style bow is because Howard Hill is actually considered the father of these bows. He generally designed and came up with this style of bow and pretty much made them famous many years ago. But they'll have that D cross section. They'll typically have a straight grip. Some of them may have a mild dish, and you can get bows that have some form of locator grip on them. But generally it's going to be a straight grip, very short riser, and then a long limb with a steady curve to it. And again, you'll see the string does not touch the belly of the bow in any way. That's an American semi-longbow, or a hill style bow, or again, a D style bow. That D style, again, does not come from the shape of the bow, it comes from that cross section. A lot of people get that wrong or mixed up. Now, if you take a hill style bow and look at it unstrung, what you'll see is you've basically got a straight piece of wood, generally speaking. If you'll notice on this bow, as you come out towards the tip of the limb, you'll see that it has a little bit of curvature pointing back towards the front of the riser, and it gets a little bit ahead of the riser. You'll hear that referred to as backset, and that's just a means of building the bow so that you've got a little bit more stored energy, which gives you a little bit more speed out of this bow. Now you'll also see some of these bows that are either perfectly straight, or it might even have the limb tip not quite go all the way straight, so it's still a little bit behind the front of the riser, so it's curved just a little bit the opposite direction of this. That's referred to as string follow, and that will generally give you a bow that's a little bit more forgiving, so it's less critical of your shot execution than a bow like this. Howard Hill actually said that all other things being equal, a string follow bow would shoot more consistently and be more accurate than one with backset. But just choose which one you like the best. Personally, I can't tell a lot of difference between either one. Real briefly, before we move on, this is another bow that looks very similar to those ASL bows. And some may actually even refer to this as an ASL style bow. I would say it's definitely not a D style bow, because if you look at the back of the bow and the belly of the bow, they're pretty much the same. I actually refer to this as a flat bow. Others may disagree with me, but you know, everything else is pretty consistent with that American semi-longbow style, except for the limb design, and they shoot fantastic. This is another St. Charles bow, and I've got several of these bows, and I absolutely love it. That's his classic longbow. But again, I think it's more of a flat bow. Opinions may vary on that one, but you may run into some of those, so just keep it in mind. Lastly, in the longbow class is your hybrid longbow, and it's called that because it's kind of a mix between a longbow and a recurve. You'll also hear these referred to as RD, or reflex deflex style bows, and the reason being is you've got that same curvature, though not as radical in the limb as you did with the recurve. And you can tell it's not as radical here because you do still have a gap of airspace between the string and the belly of the bow. It's only touching in the nocks. This falls into the classification of a longbow. If that limb tip curved just a little bit more, that string would touch and then it would become a recurve. But this is a longbow. It's a hybrid or reflex deflex, and most of these are going to have some form of grip in the handle. One thing that I didn't mention about these American semi-longbows is some people find them hard to shoot because they get a little bit more felt recoil in the handle when they're shooting it, and that's because of the way the limbs work. And these hybrid style bows have less of that felt recoil, which is a lot of the reason a lot of people that like a longbow go to these hybrid styles. And they're also, generally speaking, a little bit faster than the ASL style bows. But again, with really heavy arrows, I have found that that speed difference is not as significant as it is when the arrows are lighter. So again, keep that in mind. Now, if you look at one of these RD bows unstrung, you'll see that it does favor that recurve where you have this curvature of the limb with a much more pronounced than the straight bow where that limb tip is pointing back towards the front of the bow. But if I strung this bow, that string would not touch the belly just like it does in the one I just showed you. So again, it is a long bow. And the other piece is you will find that there's a lot of variation in the amount of reflex that you'll find. So some can be much less aggressive than other ones. This one doesn't have a lot of reflex to it, but it does have enough that it does take away some of that hand shock and gives a little bit more speed. So just keep that in mind. You can see a lot more curvature on some of these hybrid bows and a lot less in others. Now lastly, as we're wrapping this up, I do want to spend a few more minutes talking about self bows. I mentioned the English longbow as being a self bow. But when you're thinking about a self bow, think about any bow that's pretty much carved from a single piece of wood. So you don't have those laminations of various wood and fiberglass. Somebody took a long length of wood and carved this bow out. Now you'll notice this one, you have that same flat back with a curved belly. So if I cut this limb, it would actually have that D-shaped cross section, but it's still not a semi-longbow or American semi-longbow. This is referred to as a self bow. However, self bows can be longbows, they can be recurves, they can be static tip recurves, and there's even a lot more that we're not going to get into. So there's a lot of variations in these self bows too. But when you hear self bow, just think a bow carved from one piece of wood. And lastly, you may also hear the term backed bow or backing on a bow. This is another self bow. It bends all the way through the full length of the bow, including the handle. So when you shoot this, you can actually feel it bending in the handle of the bow. It's made of hickory, which is a really good bow wood. But this Boyer Mark Troy actually backed this bow with rawhide, which just gives it a lot more durability and longevity over time. Wood used for self bows has to have two qualities. It has to be able to compress the wood fibers here in the belly when you're shooting it, because the bow limb bends, and it has to be able to stretch on the back of the bow. As the bow limb bends, this has to stretch. Some woods do that very well, some less than others. So adding backing to the bow can help a wood that maybe not be as good a bow wood as another survive and function very well and be a very long-lived bow. And it can also take a bow that's made from wood that does have those qualities and make it last even longer. So if you hear the term backing, that's all it is. This can be rawhide, which this one is. It can be sinew. It can be even cloth that you can back these bows with. And it just gives them a much more durable back to the bow in that the stretching can actually occur in this additional material that's been added. And that's it for this video. I am going to do the next video probably talking about some various terminologies that you'll hear describing bows. Or telling you things that you have to be aware of to set up and keep a bow tuned properly, such as brace height. We'll talk about bow length, AMO standards, those kind of things. That'll be a fairly short video, but that one will be coming soon following this one. So until then, get out there, start shooting. I hope you enjoy it, and I hope these videos are helping, and we'll look to see you next time. Thanks so much.